This is a high-level overview of First Chronicles. First Chronicles 1. All right, let's take it back to the very beginning. Adam, the first man. From him came Seth, then Enosh. Then his descendants kept multiplying. Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, the one who walked with God. Methuselah, the oldest man to ever do it. Lamech, and then Noah. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and from them came all the nations. Japheth's descendants spread out far, forming different tribes and nations. Ham's line brought forth powerful people like the Egyptians and Canaanites. Then we got Shem, whose lineage eventually led to Abraham, the one God made big promises to. Abraham had Isaac and Ishmael, and both of them became fathers of great nations. Ishmael's sons grew into powerful tribes, while Isaac had Esau and Jacob. Jacob being the one chosen to carry on the covenant. Esau's people became the Edomites, with kings ruling over them before Israel even had a king. This whole chapter is laying out the foundation, showing how all these families spread out and how God's promise was passed down through the generations. It's a long list, but it's all leading to something bigger. First Chronicles 2. Now we're getting into the family tree of Israel, aka Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons and they became the 12 tribes of Israel. It starts with Judah's line, since that's the tribe that eventually led to King David. Judah had 3 sons, but because of some messy drama with Tamar, his family tree took some unexpected turns. Still, from his line came Perez, and later on, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, a leader in Moses' time, and Salmon, who had Boaz. Yeah, the same Boaz who married Ruth. Boaz and Ruth had Obed, who had Jesse, and Jesse had a bunch of sons, including David, the future king. The chapter keeps listing out the descendants of Hezron, Jerahmeel, and Caleb. These were all important families within the tribe of Judah, showing how God was setting things up for the kingdom to come. This is more than just a family tree. It's a setup for how Israel's history unfolds, leading straight to David and, eventually, to Jesus. First Chronicles 3. Now we're zooming in on David's family tree. David had a lot of sons from different wives, and this chapter lays them all out. His firstborn was Amnon from Ahinoam, then came Daniel from Abigail, Absalom from Maacah, Adonijah from Haggith, Shephatiah from Abital, and Ithream from Eglah. These were his sons born while he ruled in Hebron. But when David moved to Jerusalem, he had more kids, Solomon being the most famous, born from Bathsheba. Along with Solomon, Bathsheba had 3 other sons, Shimea, Shobab, and Nathan. David's lineage continued through Solomon, leading to the kings of Judah, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, and so on, all the way down to the exile in Babylon. Even after the exile, the family line kept going, setting up the stage for the return of the Israelites. This chapter is a straight-up royal genealogy, showing how David's family stayed in power and how God's promise to keep his lineage going never failed. First Chronicles 4. Now, we're diving into the family lines of Judah and Simeon, but there's one standout moment in the middle of all these names, Jabez. Judah's descendants are listed first, showing how different families branched out, building towns and leading communities. Then, out of nowhere, we hear about Jabez. He was known for his deep faith, and he prayed a bold prayer. God, bless me for real. Expand my territory, keep your hand on me, and protect me from harm so I won't have to struggle. And guess what? God granted his request. That's a major moment in the middle of all these genealogies, showing that faith and prayer can change everything. After that, the list continues with more leaders, warriors, and builders who shaped the tribe of Judah. Then it shifts to the tribe of Simeon, whose people spread out and took new lands because they had strong numbers and God's favor. This chapter shows how different families within Israel grew, thrived, and even overcame struggles, especially when they leaned on God. 1 Chronicles 5. Now we're looking at the tribes that settled east of the Jordan: Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Reuben was technically the firstborn of Jacob, but because he messed up by sleeping with his father's concubine, he lost his birthright. That blessing got passed down to Joseph's sons instead, and the leadership went to Judah's tribe. Even though Reuben still had descendants, his tribe never got that top spot. Reuben's people settled in a good land and grew strong. Then we see Gad's tribe, who also had mighty warriors and lived east of the Jordan. Same with the half-tribe of Manasseh. These tribes had big armies and were known for their skills in battle. At one point, all these tribes went to war, and they won. Not because they were the strongest, but because they trusted God and called on Him for help. But later on, they started slipping, turning to other gods, and that led to their downfall. Eventually, the Assyrians came in and took them into exile. This chapter is a reminder. Strength and numbers don't matter if you're not staying faithful to God. When they trusted Him, they thrived. When they turned away, they fell. 1 Chronicles 6. This chapter breaks down the family line of Levi, the tribe set apart for God's work. These were the priests and temple workers, handling everything from sacrifices to worship. It starts with Levi's sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. From Kohath's line came Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. Aaron's descendants became the high priests, including Eleazar, Phinehas, and later Zadok, who played a big role in Solomon's time. The chapter also lists the Levites assigned to different temple duties, like leading worship and taking care of the tabernacle. Some of the well-known worship leaders came from here, including Asaph, Heman, and Ethan, the same guys who wrote some of the Psalms. Then it details the cities given to the Levites. Since they weren't given their own tribal land, they were spread throughout Israel, living in cities given to them by the other tribes. This chapter shows that the Levites weren't just any tribe. They were chosen to serve God directly, leading the people in worship and keeping the faith alive. 1 Chronicles 7. This chapter lists the descendants of several Israelite tribes, focusing on their growth and military strength. These weren't just names. These were warriors, leaders, and families that shaped the nation. Issachar, a strong tribe with mighty warriors. They had 87,000 fighting men, showing they were a force to be reckoned with. Benjamin. Their family line is listed, highlighting their role in Israel's history, eventually leading to King Saul. Naphtali, a brief mention of their descendants. Manasseh, half-tribe, spread out across different lands, growing into a powerful group. Ephraim. This tribe had some heartbreak when raiders killed some of their sons, but they rebounded, and from them came Joshua, the leader who took Israel into the Promised Land. Asher, another strong tribe with a lot of warriors, reaching 26,000 fighting men. This chapter is showing how these tribes multiplied, grew strong, and played major roles in Israel's history. It's a reminder that God was fulfilling His promise to make His people numerous and powerful. 1 Chronicles 8. This chapter zooms in on the tribe of Benjamin, giving a detailed breakdown of their descendants. Benjamin's tribe was small compared to some others, but they produced some major figures in Israel's history. It starts with Benjamin's sons and their families, showing how the tribe expanded. Then it highlights the family of Saul, Israel's first king. His lineage is traced through his son Jonathan, leading to future generations who carried on the family name. The Benjamites were known for being skilled warriors, especially archers. Many of them settled in Jerusalem, showing their influence even before David's time. This chapter reminds us that while Judah had the royal line of David, Benjamin also had a significant role in shaping Israel's leadership and history. 1 Chronicles 9. This chapter shifts focus from genealogy to who returned to Jerusalem after the exile. When Israel was unfaithful, they were taken into exile in Babylon. But when they came back, certain families and tribes resettled in their homeland. The first to return were from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. They came back to rebuild and restore what was lost. The Levites and priests were also listed because they had special roles in maintaining worship and temple duties. They were responsible for guarding the temple, leading praise, and handling sacrifices. The gatekeepers had an important job, protecting the entrances of the temple and making sure everything inside was kept holy. The chapter ends by revisiting Saul's family line, possibly as a reminder of Israel's past leadership before David's dynasty took over. This chapter is about restoration. Even after exile and hardship, God brought his people back home, keeping his promise to them. 1 Chronicles 10. This chapter tells the tragic end of King Saul and his sons in battle against the Philistines. The Philistines attacked Israel, and Saul's army was struggling. His sons, including Jonathan, were killed in the fight. Saul was badly wounded, and instead of being captured alive, he chose to fall on his own sword. When the Philistines found his body, they took his armor, paraded it around as a trophy, and even hung his head in their temple as a sign of victory. The people of Jabesh Gilead, who remembered Saul's early heroics, rescued his body and gave him a proper burial. The chapter ends with a key reason for Saul's downfall. He was unfaithful to God. He disobeyed God's commands and even turned to a medium for guidance instead of seeking God. Because of this, God removed him and gave the kingdom to David. This is a lesson about obedience. When leaders turn away from God, they lose their way. Saul had potential, but his choices led to his downfall, making way for David to step into his destiny. 1 Chronicles 11. This chapter marks the beginning of David's reign as king and shows how he took his rightful place as leader of Israel. Israel unites behind David. After Saul's death, all the tribes came together and made David their king, recognizing that God had chosen him. David takes Jerusalem. The city was still under Jebusite control, but David and his men took the fortress of Zion, making it the new capital, the city of David. David's mighty warriors. The chapter highlights the elite warriors who stood by David, including Yashobim, took out 300 men with just his spear. Eleazar stood his ground in battle even when everyone else fled. The Three. These warriors risked their lives to get David water from enemy territory, showing their extreme loyalty. Benaiah, a fearless fighter who took down a lion in a pit on a snowy day and defeated an Egyptian giant. This chapter shows how God elevated David and surrounded him with loyal, fearless warriors. It's a reminder that when you walk in your purpose, the right people will stand with you, and no obstacle can stop what God has planned. 1 Chronicles 12. This chapter highlights the warriors who joined David as he rose to power, showing how God was building a strong team around him. Mighty warriors from different tribes came to support David while he was still on the run from Saul. These men were skilled fighters, known for their strength, courage, and loyalty. The Benjamites, Saul's own relatives, even switched sides, showing they recognized David as the rightful king. The Gadites were described as fierce, fast, and unstoppable in battle, like lions crossing a raging river. Issachar's men were known for their wisdom. They understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Zebulun, Naphtali, and others brought thousands of warriors, fully armed and ready for battle. By the time David was crowned king, hundreds of thousands of warriors stood with him, completely united. They weren't just skilled, they had undivided hearts, fully committed to David's leadership. This chapter shows that when God is moving in your life, He will send the right people to stand with you, people who bring strength, wisdom, and full commitment to the mission. 1 Chronicles 13. David wanted to bring back the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, to Jerusalem. He gathered the leaders and the people, and they all agreed. It was time to bring the Ark home. The journey begins. David and the people celebrated as they moved the Ark from Kiriath Jearim, playing music and worshiping. Uzzah's mistake. The Ark was being transported on a cart, but when the oxen stumbled, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it. God struck him down on the spot because touching the Ark was strictly forbidden. David's reaction. He was both angry and afraid, realizing they hadn't handled the Ark properly. Instead of taking it to Jerusalem, he left it at Obed-Edom's house. God blessed Obed-Edom. With the Ark in his home, everything in his life prospered, showing that God's presence brings favor when respected. This chapter is a lesson on honoring God's holiness. David had good intentions, but God's way matters more than our plans. When we move in obedience, blessings follow. 1 Chronicles 14. After David became king, God started elevating him, showing everyone that he was the chosen leader of Israel. King Hiram of Tyre sent materials and workers to build David a palace. This was a sign that even foreign nations recognized David's rising power. David knew his success came from God. He wasn't just winning for himself, but because God was establishing his kingdom for the sake of Israel. David's victories over the Philistines. The Philistines heard David was king and came looking for a fight, but David didn't move without asking God first. God told David to attack, and he won the battle at Baal-perazim, meaning the Lord has broken through, because God gave them a breakthrough victory. When the Philistines came back, David asked God again. This time, God gave him a different strategy. Circle around them and wait for a sound in the trees, which would signal that God was going ahead of them. David obeyed, and Israel won another decisive victory. This chapter reminds us that success comes from God. David didn't rely on his own strength. He sought God's direction first, and because of that, he kept winning. 1 Chronicles 15. After the first failed attempt to move the Ark, David realized he had to do it God's way, not just his way. So this time, he got everything in order before bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. Preparing the right way. David made sure the Levites were the only ones carrying the Ark, as God had commanded. He told them, "Last time, we didn't follow God's instructions, and that's why things went wrong. This time, they made sure to do it the right way, with prayer and obedience, bringing the Ark to Jerusalem. The priests and Levites purified themselves, and they carried the Ark on their shoulders using the poles. No carts this time. There was a huge celebration with music, singing, trumpets, harps, and cymbals as they brought the Ark into the city. David danced with everything he had, wearing a linen robe, completely unbothered by what people thought. He was giving his full praise to God. But Michal, Saul's daughter, saw David dancing and looked down on him. She didn't understand the power of true worship. This chapter is a lesson in honoring God the right way. When David followed God's instructions, everything went smoothly. It also shows that real worship isn't about looking dignified. It's about giving God your whole heart, no matter what people think. 1 Chronicles 16. Now that the Ark of the Covenant was finally in Jerusalem, David led the people in a powerful celebration, giving praise, offerings, and thanksgiving to God. David's celebration and worship. Burnt offerings and peace offerings were made before God. David handed out food to everyone, bread, meat, and raisin cakes, so the whole nation could celebrate together. He appointed Levites to lead worship before the Ark, making sure praise was always going up to God. David's Song of Thanksgiving, Psalm of Praise. David sang a song of praise, telling the people to give thanks and call on God's name. Remember his miracles and faithfulness. Declare his greatness among all nations. Worship him with joy and reverence. He reminded them that God made a covenant with Abraham, protected his people, and always keeps his promises. The song ended with a call for the heavens, earth, sea, and everything in creation to praise God. Final blessings. After the celebration, David sent the people home with joy. The Levites were assigned daily worship duties, ensuring praise never stopped in Israel. This chapter teaches that worship is more than just an event. It's a lifestyle. David made sure thanksgiving, music, and praise became part of Israel's daily life, showing us that God should always be at the center of everything we do. 1 Chronicles 17. Now that David had settled into his palace, he had a realization. He was living in luxury while the ark of God was in a tent. He told the prophet Nathan, "I want to build God a house." At first, Nathan agreed, but later that night God gave him a different message. God's promise to David. God told Nathan to remind David, "I never asked for a house. From the beginning, I've been with my people, moving wherever they go." Instead of David building a house for God, God promised to build a house, dynasty, for David. God would establish David's family line forever, leading to a king whose rule would never end. This was a prophecy about Jesus, the Messiah, who would come from David's lineage. God vowed to never take his love away from David's descendants, even when they messed up. David's prayer of gratitude. When David heard this, he sat before God in awe and prayed, "Who am I that you would bless me like this?" He acknowledged that everything he had was because of God's favor, not his own doing. David praised God's greatness and declared, "There is no one like you." The lesson. David wanted to honor God, but God had an even bigger plan, one that would lead to Jesus, the eternal King. This chapter shows us that God's plans are always greater than our own, and his promises never fail. 1 Chronicles 18. This chapter highlights David's military victories and how God gave him success wherever he went. David's conquests. Philistines. David took control of their cities, breaking their power. Moabites. They were defeated and became subjects of Israel, paying tribute. Zobah, Arameans. David took out their army, capturing their chariots and warriors. Edomites. He established military bases there, and they became Israel's subjects. God's favor. Every victory came because God was with David, strengthening his kingdom. Even foreign kings recognized David's greatness. King Tu of Hamath sent gifts and congratulations after David defeated his enemy. David's leadership. He dedicated all the gold, silver, and treasures from his victories to God. He ruled with justice and righteousness, making sure his kingdom was run the right way. His key officials, including Joab, army commander, Jehoshaphat, recorder, and Zadok and Ahimelech, priests, helped keep things in order. This chapter shows that when God's hand is on you, victory is inevitable. David wasn't just winning battles. He was expanding God's kingdom and making sure all his success honored the Lord. 1 Chronicles 19. This chapter shows what happens when people misunderstand good intentions and how God fights for his people. David's kindness rejected. After the king of Ammon died, David sent messengers to comfort his son Hanun, thinking he was continuing a peaceful relationship. But Hanun's advisors convinced him that David's men were spies, so he humiliated them, shaving off half their beards and cutting their clothes short. This was a major insult. War breaks out. Realizing they messed up, the Ammonites hired Aramean, Syrian mercenaries to fight Israel. David sent Joab and his army, who found themselves surrounded. Ammonites on one side, Arameans on the other. Joab split the army. He took the best fighters against the Arameans, while his brother Abishai handled the Ammonites. Joab's pep talk: "Be strong and fight bravely. The Lord will do what is right." The Arameans ran first, and when the Ammonites saw that, they fled too. A total failure for them. The Arameans try again and lose again. The Arameans regrouped with reinforcements, but David himself led Israel into battle and defeated them completely. Their leader Hadadezer was crushed, and all the kings under him submitted to David. The lesson: Hanun could have had peace, but pride and bad advice led to war and defeat. God defended David's people, proving again that when he is with you, no enemy can stand against you. 1 Chronicles 20. This chapter highlights David's victories over the Ammonites and the Philistines, showing how God continued to give Israel the upper hand in battle. The defeat of the Ammonites. After the events in the last chapter, Joab led the army against the Ammonite capital, Rabbah. When the city was about to fall, David came in and took the victory, claiming the Ammonite king's crown. It was massive and covered in gold and jewels. The Israelites took great amounts of treasure and put the Ammonites under their control. Battles against the Philistines. More war broke out, and Israel's warriors took down some of the Philistines' strongest giants. Sibbecai killed Sippai, a descendant of the giants. Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath. Yes, that Goliath. Jonathan, David's nephew, killed a giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a reminder that even the biggest enemies fall before God's people. The lesson: David and his warriors kept winning because God was with them. No matter how powerful the enemy looked, whether armies, kings, or giants, Israel came out victorious. When God has chosen you, no giant can stand against you. 1 Chronicles 21. This chapter tells the story of David's biggest mistake, taking a census of Israel without God's approval, which led to serious consequences. David's sin, the census. Satan influenced David to take a census, making him rely on numbers instead of trusting God's power. Joab warned him that it was a bad idea, but David insisted. The count was taken. 1.1 million fighting men in Israel and 470,000 in Judah. But God was not pleased. God's judgment. David immediately regretted his decision and asked for forgiveness. God gave him 3 punishment options through the prophet Gad. 1. 3 years of famine. 2. 3 months of enemy attacks. 3 days of plague from God. David chose the plague, saying, "I'd rather fall into God's hands than man's because his mercy is great." 70,000 people died before God had mercy and stopped the angel of destruction. David's repentance and the altar. David saw the angel about to strike Jerusalem and begged God to punish him, not the people. God told him to build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah, or Nan, the Jebusite. David bought the land for full price, offered sacrifices, and God answered by sending fire from heaven. The plague stopped, and David realized this was the place where the future temple would be built. The lesson: trust God, not numbers. David's strength was never in his army size. It was in God. Disobedience brings consequences, but repentance brings mercy. When David humbled himself, God showed grace. God can turn mistakes into purpose. The place of David's repentance became the site of Solomon's temple, where God's glory would dwell. 1 Chronicles 22. Now that David knew where the future temple would be built, on the threshing floor where God stopped the plague, he started making serious preparations for his son Solomon to build it. David's preparations for the temple. He gathered huge amounts of materials: gold, silver, bronze, iron, cedar wood, and stone, more than could be counted. He brought in skilled workers to cut stones and craft everything needed. David knew Solomon was young, so he wanted everything ready for him to build a glorious house for God. David's instructions to Solomon. God told me I can't build the temple because I'm a man of war, but you will build it. May the Lord give you wisdom and success as you lead Israel. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. God is with you. David's call to the leaders. He told the officials of Israel to support Solomon and stay committed to God. Now is the time to seek the Lord and build his house. The lesson. David wasn't bitter that he couldn't build the temple. He still made sure the next generation was set up for success. Obedience matters more than ambition. David accepted God's plan, and his legacy continued through Solomon. Big visions require preparation. David didn't just dream. He took action to make sure the temple would be built right. 1 Chronicles 23. As David got older, he made sure everything was in order before Solomon became king, especially when it came to the Levites and the work of the temple. David makes Solomon king. David officially handed over the throne to Solomon while he was still alive, ensuring a smooth transition. Organizing the Levites. David counted the Levites, men 30 and older, and found 38,000 of them. He divided them into specific roles. 24,000 were assigned to temple work. 6,000 became officials and judges. 4,000 were gatekeepers. 4,000 were musicians and worship leaders praising God daily. New responsibilities for the Levites. Since there was no longer a traveling tabernacle, the Levites' duties changed. Instead of carrying the ark, they focused on assisting priests, maintaining the temple, and leading worship. David's final instructions. He made sure the Levites understood their new role and set the foundation for Solomon's future temple leadership. The lesson. Good leadership prepares the next generation. David didn't leave chaos. He set Solomon up for success. Worship wasn't an afterthought. David assigned 4,000 Levites just to lead praise, showing that honoring God should be a daily priority. 1 Chronicles 24. This chapter breaks down how David organized the priests into 24 divisions for their temple duties, making sure everything ran smoothly when Solomon built the temple. Dividing the priests into groups. The descendants of Aaron, the high priest's family, were split into two main branches. Eleazar's line had more leaders, so they got more groups. Ithamar's line, fewer but still included. Each group took turns serving in the temple, ensuring fairness and order. Choosing the order by lot. To avoid favoritism, they cast lots, like drawing names from a hat, and the 24 groups were assigned their rotation. This system lasted for generations. Even in Jesus' time, Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, was serving in one of these rotations. Luke 1:8-9. Levites were also assigned roles. Just like the priests, the rest of the Levites were organized into their specific tasks. The lesson. God is a God of order. David didn't leave things chaotic. He made sure the priests served in an organized and fair way. Everyone had a role in worship. Whether priests or Levites, all played a part in honoring God. Spiritual work requires structure. This system ensured consistent worship and service to God. 1 Chronicles 25. This chapter focuses on how David organized the musicians and worship leaders in the temple. Worship wasn't just a side thing, it was a structured and essential part of honoring God. The worship leaders. David and the leaders appointed 288 skilled musicians from the families of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun. These men were not just singers, they were prophets who used music to declare God's truth. They played harps, lyres, and cymbals in the temple, leading Israel in praise, dividing the worship teams. Just like the priests, the musicians were divided into 24 groups, each taking turns leading worship in the temple. Young and old, experienced and new musicians all served together, making sure worship never stopped. The lesson. Worship is warfare. These musicians weren't just entertainers, they were spiritual warriors, using music to shift atmospheres. God values excellence in worship. David made sure worship was organized, skillful, and led by those called to it. Praise should be continuous. With 24 groups rotating, worship was always happening, just like we should keep praise in our hearts daily. 1 Chronicles 26. This chapter breaks down the gatekeepers, treasurers, and officials who helped run the temple, showing that serving God wasn't just about priests and musicians. Administration and security mattered too. Gatekeepers, protecting the temple. The gatekeepers were like security guards, keeping the temple holy and making sure only the right people entered. They were chosen from the families of Korah and Merari, with Shelemiah, Zechariah, Obed-Edom, and Meshelemiah leading them. Obed-Edom's family was especially blessed. Because he once housed the ark, God gave him many sons in favor. Treasurers and officials managing God's resources. Some Levites were assigned to manage the temple's treasures, making sure the gold, silver, and offerings were handled properly. Others served as government officials, military leaders, and judges, helping Israel stay organized and just. The lesson. Every role matters in God's kingdom. From guarding the doors to handling finances, all service is important. God blesses those who serve faithfully. Obed-Edom's story proves that serving God leads to favor. Order and integrity are key. David made sure everything in the temple was managed with care and honesty. 1 Chronicles 27. This chapter lays out David's military, tribal, and royal officials, showing how Israel's leadership was structured and organized. The army, 12 divisions. David set up a rotating army system, 12 divisions of 24,000 soldiers each, taking turns serving 1 month per year. Key commanders included Jashobim, Dodai, Benaiah, and others. Many were David's mighty men. This system ensured Israel always had a ready army without overburdening the people. Tribal leaders, regional authority. Each of Israel's 12 tribes had a leader, responsible for governance and handling affairs in their region. Royal officials, managing resources. David appointed officials to oversee agriculture, livestock, vineyards, and storehouses, making sure the kingdom's economy stayed strong. Jonathan, David's uncle, was a wise counselor, and Ahithophel, who later betrayed David, was also a top advisor. Joab remained the commander of the army, holding a powerful position. The lesson. Good leadership requires structure. David didn't just rely on his own strength. He built a strong team. Preparation prevents crisis. By rotating the army, David ensured Israel was always ready without exhausting the people. Even kings need wise advisors. David had counselors, administrators, and military leaders, proving success is never a one-man job. 1 Chronicles 28. As David's reign neared its end, he gathered all of Israel's leaders to give them his final words. focusing on God's plan for the temple and Solomon's future as king. David's speech to Israel. He reminded them that God chose him to be king, but God didn't allow him to build the temple because he was a man of war. Instead, God chose Solomon to build it and promised, if Solomon stays faithful, his kingdom will last forever. David urged the leaders to obey God's commands and support Solomon in this great task. David's charge to Solomon. Know God personally and serve him with all your heart. If you seek him, you will find him. If you abandon him, he will reject you. Be strong and do the work. Don't be afraid, because God is with you. David gives Solomon the temple plans. David handed Solomon the detailed blueprints for the temple, including the design, furniture, and priestly duties. He emphasized that these plans came directly from God, not his own imagination. He reassured Solomon, God will not fail you. He will help you complete this task. The lesson. Legacy is about passing the baton. David couldn't build the temple, but he made sure Solomon had everything he needed to succeed. Obedience determines destiny. Solomon's success depended on his faithfulness to God. Fear has no place when God is with you. David reminded Solomon that God's presence guarantees victory. He just had to step up and do the work. 1 Chronicles 29. As David's reign came to an end, he made sure everything was set for Solomon to build the temple and led Israel in a powerful moment of giving, praise, and transition. David's final offerings for the temple. David gave a massive personal donation of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and precious stones for the temple. He then asked the people, who else is willing to give? The leaders, officials, and people gave generously and willingly, celebrating the opportunity to contribute. David's prayer of praise. David blessed God in front of the whole assembly, saying, everything we have comes from you. We are only giving back what you already own. You test the heart, and you delight in those who give freely. He prayed for Solomon to have a loyal heart and for the people to remain faithful to God. Solomon becomes king. After the offering and worship, Solomon was officially anointed as king before all of Israel. David's reign ended in honor and success, and soon after, he passed away, full of years and blessings. The lesson. Giving is a heart matter. The people didn't give out of pressure. They gave joyfully because they loved God. True wealth belongs to God. David understood that everything we have is just temporarily in our hands. A strong finish matters. David couldn't build the temple, but he set up Solomon for success and ended his reign glorifying God.